Welcome to the Viper rotation guide for the first Dawntrail Ultimate, Futures Rewritten. This video will cover everything you need to know in order to have an optimized rotation, and is the result of hundreds of hours of spreadsheeting, in-game testing, and community feedback. Let's dive right in. If you want to follow along in more depth, I have a written guide posted on the Balance website, with a lot more graphics and a lot more information for you to go through. For a brief fight overview, the GCD we want to run is 2.10. It's possible to play optimally at 2.12, but the rotation is very different and will need its own guide. For limit break priority, it changes depending on the phase. For us, we should never be limit breaking unless we are solo melee or paired with a Reaper. If you have to LB, take a look at the limit break section in the written guide. We start the fight with a modified opener. Because the opener is so short, the normal 1-2 Vicewinder opener ends up being much worse. So instead, we start with a Vicewinder, Reawaken, 2 Uncoiled Furies, another Vicewinder combo, and end on a dual wield GCD. After Utopian Sky, we'll always reopen with a normal 1-2 Vice combo. This will overcap Vicewinder by roughly 5 seconds, but that's completely fine in this case since it won't result in losing a use. From here there are 2 rotations you can do for the remainder of the phase, a double Reawaken burst or a single Reawaken burst. Let's look at a double first. Doing a double Reawaken for the burst window will mean using 2 Uncoiled Furies anytime during Fall of Faith. From there, you'll hit 60 gauge, do a Vicewinder combo, and immediately go into your Reawaken burst. Serpent's Ire will come off cooldown as soon as you press the first Reawaken. Being early means you'll finish your second Reawaken before the Burnt Strike, and then you'll have 2 Uncoiled Furies to cover the tower soaks. However, if you find yourself killing phase 1 too fast, you can instead switch to a single Reawaken burst to move more damage into phase 2. For a single Reawaken burst, only use 1 Uncoiled Fury during Fall of Faith. Then, hit 60 gauge, and start a dual wield combo. Do a Vicewinder combo after the starter, and then finish the dual wield combo and burst. After that, you'll spend 4 Uncoiled Furies with a Vicewinder split in the middle of them to disengage from the boss. Moving into Phase 2. The rotation going into Diamond Dust will look different depending on how fast Phase 1 was killed and whether you did a single or a double Reawaken burst window. Therefore, the goal is just to hit 80 gauge in one Rattling Coil before Diamond Dust. Both burst windows should be able to end up hitting this goal. If you end up killing Phase 1 too fast, you may end up with 70 gauge instead. The rotation during Mirror Mirror is a little bit special. Because there's a burst window and we're nearly capped on gauge and Rattling Coils, most of the window will be spent using these higher potency GCDs. We'll use a total of 2 Vicewinders, 2 Reawakens, 4 Uncoiled Furies, a single dual wield combo, and a combo starter. As soon as the boss is targetable, we'll reopen with Vicewinder, specifically starting with Hunter's Coil first, and then do our double Reawaken as normal, and then finish with 2 Uncoiled Furies. After this, we'll refresh buffs with another Vicewinder combo, do 2 more Uncoiled Furies, and then end the phase with the dual wield GCDs. After Light Rampant, we'll start preparing for Intermission. We'll refresh our buffs that are just about to fall off with a Vicewinder combo, and then we'll do 1 Uncoiled Fury, and then finish with 2 dual wield combos. Our last GCD should be Vicewinder, and we'll carry over the combo into Intermission. Now, Intermission can get a little tricky with targeting and variable crystal kill times. Despite this, we'll end up consistently using 2 Vicewinder combos, 2 Reawakens, and 2 to 3 Uncoiled Furies. The whole sequence will look something like this. The Uncoiled Furies can be moved around to kill your crystal or help with someone else's crystal. The third Uncoiled Fury is only possible if you follow your ABCs perfectly and keep perfect GCD uptime. This isn't always going to be the case. If you ever clip your GCD, even a little bit, you can drop that last Uncoiled Fury and move it into Phase 3. If this happens, you can use another Vicewinder as your last GCD and carry the combo over into Phase 3. Here's what it looks like first with clipping your GCD, and then I'll show you what it looks like with perfect ABCs. phase 3, we get a little bit of a break and can start using our standard rotation fundamentals. The entire phase is full uptime, and we'll end up using about 4 reawakens before phase 4, 1 during ultimate relativity, 2 during our burst window, and 1 during apocalypse. Now, we need to do a little bit of prep work with our rotation before the rewind happens at the end of ultimate relativity. We want to be combo neutral before the rewind. This means we're not in an active dual wield combo. The way we make this happen is with Uncoiled Fury. If you're starting phase 3 on an actual Vicewinder, then you'll use 2 Uncoiled Furies during ultimate relativity. But if you're starting phase 3 with a carried over Vicewinder combo, then you'll use 3 Uncoiled Furies instead. The reason we want to do this is so that our last GC to use before the rewind is a Vicewinder. Doing this will refresh our buffs before burst so that there's no chance for them to drop afterward. The following footage will show a carried over combo, as this will most likely be the most common option. For Apocalypse, there's only 1 to 2 notes. The first note is to save 1 to 2 Uncoiled Furies for Spirit Taker so that you can keep GCD uptime. The other is to either use Reawaken before Dark Eruption finishes or after the knockback and the stacks happen. The rotation leading to the dark-lit burst window will look slightly different depending on what GCD you start with. If you follow the rotation up to this point, you should be starting P4 on a finisher. Doing so will mean doing 3 dual-wield combos and 1 Vicewinder combo before bursting. If you're doing the alternate phase 2 rotation listed in the written guide, you may find yourself starting a combo neutral. This will have you do the same, but add an additional Uncoiled Fury at the very end. Now if you find yourself starting on a buffing GCD, this means you'll be in an active dual-wield combo during burst. This just means you'll have to continue the combo afterward. If you're at this point though, it most likely means you made a mistake earlier. However, starting on a buffing GCD only matters if you decide to do one of the 2 rotation options for phase 4, which I'll explain a little bit later. This burst window is also a pot window, but if you pot it in intermission, it comes off cooldown a bit later than when burst starts. To compensate for this, we can use Uncoiled Fury right when Gaia spawns to delay our burst enough to use our potion as it comes off cooldown. This will happen after pressing Reawaken. If you started the phase combo neutral, this is required. If you started on a finisher, then it should come off cooldown in time without needing Uncoiled Fury. This will only happen if you use pot immediately after getting unfrozen in intermission. If you find that it's not up in time, you can still use Uncoiled Fury before bursting to give yourself that time. In the following footage, this is exactly what I did, because I didn't pot early enough in intermission for it to be up in time. Now, after the burst window, there are 2 rotation options to choose from. Option 1 maximizes cleave by doing an additional reawaken outside of burst, and uses 5 total Uncoiled Furies before crystallized time. This option will put you at 30 gauge and 0 rattling coils going into CT. This option is only available if you hit 80 gauge before Diamond Dust and you started phase 4 either on a finisher or combo neutral. If both of these conditions aren't met, you won't have enough gauge to properly go into phase 5. What GCD you start the phase on matters. You can see in this graph that starting on a buffing GCD will result in either not hitting 30 gauge before CT, or losing an Uncoiled Fury in order to get the gauge. And on 2 target, this is about a 1600 potency loss. Now, the other option is to hold the gauge from that 3rd reawaken and move it into phase 5. This technique is called dead zoning. This will result in only 2 reawakens from burst and 5 total Uncoiled Furies. Doing so will have you go into CT with at least 80 gauge and 0 rattling coils. If phase 1 was killed slowly, you'll most likely be at 90 gauge here. Throughout the fight, you should have been using Serpent's Ire off cooldown. Doing this lets us get an extra use. Coming out of CT, we can reopen with a Vicewinder combo and use a free Reawaken from Ire, and finish on an Uncoiled Fury. Note that this works best if the bosses are above 20% HP going into CT, and you actually see the Enrage cast. However, this ends up rarely happening, and the bosses are pretty much dead before CT even happens. In this case, we can instead use Vice Pit sometime between placing our Rewind puddle and when the bosses become targetable. Doing this speeds up the rotation by about 3 seconds, and it puts us in a better spot to get the damage from the free Reawaken. Once the boss's HP reaches 0.1%, then any damage after that is considered overkill and effectively does 0 damage. To time Serpent's Ire properly and have it come back in time for Phase 5, we need to use it 2 to 3 seconds before placing a Rewind puddle if opening with Vicewinder, or 4 to 5 seconds before placing the puddle if we're using Vice Pit. Vice Pit is most likely going to be the better option, and I highly recommend to do this by default. Unless your group DPS is struggling in Phase 4, then Vicewinder is better. For the 5th and final phase of the fight, you should have either 40 gauge and 1 rattling coil if you did option 1, or at least 90 gauge and 1 rattling coil if you did option 2. If you're at 100 gauge here, that's completely normal and expected if phase 1 was killed around Enrage. The reopener itself is going to start with Vicewinder. If you used Ire at the proper time in Crystallized Time, it should come off cooldown just after pressing the Vicewinder. This is very important for tracking your burst timings later in the phase. If you started with 40 gauge, you'll do 8 Reawakens total, with 2 in the burst windows and 1 in between. If you started with 90 gauge, you'll do 9 total, with the extra happening after the 2-minute burst. Just like the extra Reawaken that happens naturally in our standard rotation, you'll want to hold 2 Uncoiled Furies going into the final burst so that you have the proper gauge in time. This phase is completely full uptime, and you should use the rotation fundamentals. However, if you're interested, there are many small optimizations you can make in this phase depending on several factors. If you want to know more, check out my written guide in the description.
もう少しで完全なる理想郷が完成したというのに、私たちは消えたりなんかしない。悪いけどそんなに存在感薄くないのよ。 ず一緒に帰りましょう。約束だよ。この共鳴、頭が割れそうだ。お前たちの存在など私の記憶から消えてしまえ。あの人ならきっと大丈夫じゃなきゃ承知しないわ。期待に応えてよね。そうだ、もう一度転生してくればきっと。諦めない。私たちの祈り届いて。ここはもう我らの理想郷ではない。ならば全ての存在を否定しよう。感情が重すぎるのよ。どうか負けないで。Our promise fades.